Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, or good night, wherever you're at, whenever you're listening. Welcome back or welcome to the Raising Kingdom Warriors podcast. I'm your host, Joel Pelland, where the mission is simple. Just want to add value to you. Want to add value to you as a man, as a husband, as a father, and as a leader. And today we're going to have the opportunity to do that with Sam Joleman. Sam, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Joel. It's great to be here.
Yeah, my pleasure. I think that the conversation we're about to have is one that I think a lot of dads are interested in having some guidance and some coaching in. And, we get to be a part of that process. Sam is an author and a therapist, and he has recently authored a book. You see it behind me here. For those of you on YouTube, The Sex Talk You Never Got, Reclaiming the Heart of Masculine Sexuality. And so I'm excited to jump into this conversation. I hope our listeners are ready to go. Get your notepads out because I think there'll be a lot of value added today and things that you can apply to your own parenting and maybe even to yourself. But first, I want to start, Sam, with what inspired you to write this book? Like, why write this book and make that your first book?
Yeah, well, probably at its heart was a few things. I'm a father of three boys, so 13, 10, and 7. And, the idea of like this coming, moment where I'm going to be having a conversation with my sons and feeling like, what do I say? Right. So, at one level, there was a selfish, I have to come up with what am I going to tell my sons when they come of age about what sex is, right? And more than just the plumbing conversation, right? Because the birds and the bees conversation often is just how does the plumbing work? Where do babies come from? But then what? What do you say about what it means to be a man and embody sexuality well? And I find myself saying, just from my own story, right? That was an area where I got almost nothing. Obviously, at some point, I got the plumbing conversation, the birds and the bees, but that was about it. And I noticed in my own life the trajectory that set for me of sex is something I have to figure out on my own and keep to myself. And there's not really many places you can go to talk about it. Um, which I think inherently sets up this sense of shame, right?
Right.
That if I'm trying to figure this out, because obviously there is so much more to sex than the plumbing. We all know that intuitively, right? But where
Yeah.
do you go to have that conversation, and how do you figure that stuff out? So just realizing from my own story what I'd suffered there. And then I'm a therapist, right? So I get this incredible privilege of sitting with men a lot and hearing their journey, their stories, what they're going through. And I found that, men had kind of one way to think about their sexuality, which was, am I sinning or not sinning? Am I lusting or not lusting? Am I behaving, basically? And again, there is so much more to the conversation than just, are you sinning or not sinning? Obviously, that's an important one, as is knowing the plumbing, right? But then what? How do you talk about the rest of the dance
Yeah.
and the power of sexuality in your life?
Yeah, and what you're saying just highlights the importance of fathers and mothers, parents being very intentional and consistent with the conversation. Um, there's an author, Hillary Morgan Ferrer. She wrote Mama Bear Apologetics, and she wrote one about faith, and she also wrote one about sexuality. And one of her principles is the founder's principle,
Mhm.
where if you're the first person to speak about a topic into somebody's life, they're more apt to come back to you for more information about it later. So the
Yes.
earlier you can start these conversations with your kids, they're going to see you as the source of information, not the internet or their friend or their teacher. And I think I'd like you to talk about your story because
Yeah.
I think it was chapter 4. It was where you kind of talked about, you know, how your sex education started.
Yes.
And so just talk about that story a little bit, because I think it highlights the importance of parents. You can't just brush this off and be like, oh man, it's too awkward to talk to my kid about it. I'm going to
Right.
let somebody else or some other system um, talk about these concepts with my kids.
Right.
Talk a little bit about what happened to you when
Yes.
you were in elementary school, or middle school or whatever it was, with
Yeah,
the birds and the bees and your friend and his story. I'd like you to
that's
tell
great.
it.
Yeah, so, let me just echo what you're saying to start with of I think we have this false view that innocence is the same as naivete. And so if I just don't tell my kids anything about sex, they won't be curious. And I'll protect their innocence. And what I would say is innocence, to my perspective of what Jesus is saying, innocence is childlikeness. It's
Mm,
receiving the world with awe and wonder, not just being naive. And so, what I would invite you as a parent is, it is natural in God's design for you to be curious about sexuality, for your children to be curious about sexuality. And I love what you're saying. If they can't come to you and you won't answer their questions, they will go somewhere else with it. Um, so one of the stories from my life is in fourth grade, is when my little Christian school that I went to did the birds and the bees videos, the anatomy videos. And
right.
um, somehow we got word about this, um all the kids, and it kind of put this hush between the boys and the girls, and people would kind of snicker in the corner and giggle and laugh, but we wouldn't talk to each other, the boys and the girls. And because somebody had gotten the leaked information, because they'd sent like a permission slip home to the parents, you
Right.
know so here we are, uh, and we're on the playground, and my friend Adam at the time said to me, "Do you know what sex is?" And I said, "No." And at fourth grade, I didn't. So I'm 9, maybe
Yeah.
10.
Yeah.
And yeah, I didn't know what it was. And he said, "Would you like to know?" And I was like, "Sure."
Yeah.
Right.
Tell
Like,
me all
yes,
about
please
it.
tell me the secret knowledge, right?
Yeah.
And he says, "Okay, here's what sex is." And he explains this wild scene, right? Of that involves a man and woman being naked, and the man scares the woman, and the woman scares the man, and he pees, and she catches it in her private part, and that's how babies are made. Right. And I was like, what? Right? That is weird. And
Right.
how does that work? And that's babies, and that's fun? Like, it was very troubling to me, like this sense of sex. What I can recognize now later is, and I hope this is not true, but that Adam, that is a child's interpretation, probably, of pornography.
Mm,
In other words, it's quite possible that what he had seen and where he got his data was some pornography, and which he interpreted to me. I don't know that,
right.
right? But it has that sense.
Well, it also highlights the importance of this information that's coming to you that is completely false. But what do you know? Right. And
Right.
so your buddy tells it to you when you have other questions. That's a really awkward thing to think about. I'm not talking to mom and dad about that. I'm going to go back to my buddy and ask him questions.
Right.
And he's going to give me more crap information because he doesn't know what the heck
Right.
he's talking about either.
Right. Right. And I actually did risk that day talking to my mom,
Okay.
which, kudos to my mom, right? That I felt safe enough to talk to her.
Yes. Yeah, for sure.
Um, the difficulty is, I think, again, and I have talked to my mom about this scene, and she has apologized. But she didn't answer my question. She didn't correct me. And a couple weeks later, I'm at a play date, with one of her friends and the friend's son. And my mom calls me into the kitchen where she was sitting with her friend and says, "Tell Miss Joan what you heard on the playground."
Right.
And so I said what I said, what I'd learned, and they both start laughing.
Hmm.
And, in that moment, again, standing back as an adult, it's hilarious.
Right.
Right? What was described to me as sex is comical, but I did not know the punchline, right? And as I say in my book, this is such an important part of knowing how to protect your children. In that moment, what landed in my chest was profound shame that their laughter conveyed to me, um, something's weird about my curiosity or my understanding about sex. Um, and I've got to bury this part of me. I've got to hide this part of me. Right. And you might say,
Yeah.
in that moment, that much happened? Yes. Right. In other words, Satan's greatest goal is to join shame to your sexuality.
Yeah. And you don't know that at fourth grade that you're doing all that's just how you're
No,
feeling. Yeah, you can't process that, but that's what it
no,
equals. So Sam,
right.
how can parents foster a good environment or foster a way for their children to talk to them about sex?
Well, again, I would say um, at some level, initiating conversation. And, you know, that I think at some level is inherently awkward. This is a vulnerable topic. And I would start by saying, if you have young children, setting a precedent that when they ask questions about body parts, you give them the answer, right? As you've named well, like become the source of actually factual information. Now, do you have to say everything? No. In fact, what I've read from several writers on this, and what I say in my book is it's more like 100 1-minute conversations.
Yeah.
So you don't have to say everything. In fact, they will probably check out. That you need to satisfy the thirst of their curiosity.
Yeah, I wanna pause it. I wanna highlight again 100 1-minute conversations because I completely agree with what you're saying because this isn't the birds and the bees talk singular,
Right.
right? Which is typically in the past how I've heard things worded and how people have handled that topic. But this needs
Yes,
to be an ongoing conversation,
that's
short
right.
conversations. Also, we want to show curiosity as parents on what they're wondering, right? Give
Right.
them that freedom to open up their mind, open up their thoughts, and make them feel safe to ask you the questions that they want to ask, but might be too hesitant to ask if you don't open the door first and allow them to walk through it.
Right. Right. So bless their curiosity as God given and answer it. So, for example, my sons, one of my sons, and I can't remember which one, he's 5, 4, and he says, "Dad, what are these little balls underneath my penis?"
Mm,
Right?
yeah,
What are they for? Right. And again, you're like, whoa, like we're right there. We're
yeah,
what? And
yeah.
I
There's
could have
no
said,
parenting class that can prepare you for that question.
right. But he's just being curious about his body. Can you hear? I want you to step back and hear that as almost identical to, Dad, what are these things on my feet called? Oh, those are toes. Um, or Dad, how do ears work?
Right.
Or where does hair come from? Right? Like, can you hear? He's just being curious about his body. And so, I said something like, well, those hold the cells that God uses to help make babies. And that was it.
Yeah. Oh, okay.
Yeah. Oh, okay.
Yeah.
And then, a couple months later, it was like, well, how does that work? Well, God takes a cell from a mommy and a daddy and puts it together in a mommy's tummy.
Yeah.
Okay. Right. And then it's later, but like, now it's 6 months later. But how does how
Yeah.
did right? Can you see?
It
You're just
builds.
tracking with their curiosity, and trying to speak to and answer. They probably, I guarantee they don't want an hour-long lecture.
Yeah.
They want a
Neighbor
couple
does.
minutes.
Yeah. Adults don't want hour-long lectures on any.
That's right.
Kids definitely don't want it. They get it enough at school. They definitely don't want it at home about a topic that might be awkward for them to talk about. But I love the 100 1-minute conversations approach to that.
Yeah.
What are some mistakes that parents make when talking to their kids about sex? What are some things
Yeah.
that we can avoid or should avoid?
Well, a couple thoughts. I've heard parents use um like other words than the body parts, like that there I've known children and who are adults, clients of mine, who will say, in our house, private parts were swear words. So, I would invite you, use the language, say penis, say vulva, say vagina, like you don't have to use that graphically, right? But like that you are giving your children again the blessing of the right word. Um, and I think just in general there, right? If there's a topic that's off limits in any culture or any family, right? Like we don't talk about that. Um, it sets an inherent shame over a subject. So if sexuality is not allowed to be talked about in your home or curiosity about bodies, you're going to, and again, not that you're trying, but you are setting up space for Satan to bring shame over that part of their life. Um, so I would invite, use the right words, answer their questions, um, uh, and try to be a little bit ahead of their curiosity. So like, be reading them. Um, um, I think, not blessing that curiosity or saying, well, I want to keep my children innocent. And so I'm just not going to say anything. Um, I obviously get the heart there.
Right.
Like, of course you do. And again, you don't have to tell them everything. Of course, you won't tell them everything. There's too much to say. You need a couple hundred conversations. But to try to think age appropriately, how can I say this? Because again, and I know I'm reiterating this. To me, innocence to God is not just naivete. It's wonder and awe. And so if you can cast this with wonder and awe, right? Like,
Right.
isn't it cool how God made your body? Isn't that cool
Yeah.
that you have parts of your body that make cells that make babies? Right? And when you do finally tell them about sex, to say, isn't this amazing that God made us with pleasure? For pleasure? Like, isn't that cool that he made this fun for a mommy and daddy? Like, you're casting not just, you're giving them not just information, but a mood,
Yeah.
right? You're setting a tone, as you've said well, right?
And you're also normalizing it, right? You're not making this awkward taboo, conversation where it's like hush hush, we don't talk about that kind of stuff. You're normalizing
Right.
conversation, you're normalizing the vocabulary so that it is easier to talk about as the conversations progress.
Right. Right.
Um,
Because the danger is, that I see is either men get a sex talk, if they got anything at all, they got a sex talk, and then they right away got a purity lecture.
yeah,
Right.
let's
And
talk
and
about the
and
purity lecture, because you do mention that in the book a little bit. How did the churches and the Christian purity movement impact not just men, but we're talking about men, but kids in general, who receive that message?
yeah, I think a couple things. It sets up, I think especially it sets men and women up to fear sexuality, right? That like if I feel anything in my body, it's probably sinful.
Mm,
It's probably lust, right? Like, oh my goodness, I'm feeling something. This is especially true for men, right? If I'm feeling anything in my body, it's probably lust, and I need to shut it down. So anything sexual is wrong. And I need to be afraid of it. For women, then it sets women up to believe my body is the source of men's lust. Therefore, my body is bad and I need to cover it up. And so already, right, body shame. And for a man to believe he's a half step from lust all the time, right? Like, I think the church sets men up to feel like you're an animal with urges you can barely control. And, you know, sorry, you're just, it curses the design of a man's heart to be a lover. Um, and to be moved by beauty, right? And so there's a sense of not everything maybe I could put it this way. There's a difference between arousal and lust.
Can you go into
You
that a
know,
little bit? How so? What would
yeah.
be the difference between arousal and lust?
So, Jesus' statement in the Sermon on the Mount. If any man looks at a woman lustfully, he's committing adultery, right?
Yeah.
Uh, I recently heard the Bible Project talk about the translation of that section should be something more like goes on looking. So there's an intentional action to continue to look for the cultivating of lust.
Okay.
It's not looking, period. There's an intention, right? And the word lust is interesting because there are other places where Jesus says to his disciples at the Last Supper, I have lusted to have this meal with you. It's the same word. It just means intense desire. So, in other words, you can feel arousal, even sexual arousal at the presence of another person and not turn it to lust. In other words, you could see a beautiful woman and it not be lust. You could say, that's a beautiful woman and move on.
Right.
Um, there's a woman, Sheila Gregoire, who did some research on asking the question, is lust every man's battle? Right? Is that just true? And she found that about 80% of men self-reported that they struggled with lust. So it's not every man, but it's pretty high,
Right. Yeah.
80%, right?
Yeah.
When she actually asked questions to confirm that, it's called research integrity. It's got a name. Anyway, other questions that would confirm the validity of that answer, right?
Yeah.
She found that only 33% of men had anything that looked discernibly like lust. And her conclusion from that research was this: she senses most men are just being moved by a beautiful person and they assume it's lust. They're not going on looking, they're not undressing a woman, they're not taking it any further than just they felt in their body just the being moved by a beautiful woman. And I would say similar to how you would be moved by a beautiful sunset, beautiful piece of music, right?
There's that when you said that the scene in Shawshank Redemption, when he starts playing
Yes.
the classical music over the PA system from the library, and all the inmates,
Oh, it's powerful.
they just stop and they're in awe, right, of this
Yes.
beautiful piece of music that's been playing over the loudspeaker in the prison. So if you haven't seen Shawshank Redemption, that's one of my top movies of all time. But that I just had someone text me something about awe, and then
Oh,
that scene really resonated with me.
that's so good.
So
Yeah,
how
go ahead.
I was gonna say, so how can the church do better? How can we, because we are the church, how can we do better at teaching men and young men what this is and what it means?
Yeah, I think um starting with the blessing of your sexuality is a good part of you. Right? This was something God put in Adam and Eve in the garden pre-sin. So you were made to be moved. It is a good part of you. You were made for pleasure. It's wired in your body. That's a good thing. Your body is not the same as your flesh, right? In killing the flesh, um, you're not invited to kill off your sexuality. Um, and so some blessing of your body is good. It's the artwork of God. And so for women to say, you are not responsible for a man's lusts. Um, and again, conversations on how you steward well the glory of your body.
Right.
Of course, right? And would
Yeah.
that involve things like what you wear? Sure, but to not set the conversation as you don't want to cause men to stumble. That burdens something on women with something that God never does, right? Jesus' solution to lust was gouge out your eye, not go tell that woman not to dress like that. So I would want to say your lust is your responsibility, but I would also want to say you are not an animal who has uncontrollable urges. Sexuality is a powerful thing in our bodies, um, but it is not the same as um, being moved in your body is not the same as experiencing lust. Lust is taking it further and involves participation. So leaving that space for, um, blessing this as a good part of you. Um, and then I think as well, just doing healthy sex education, meaning like you explain the body parts and, um, some understanding of things like arousal cycles and, and, uh, you know, and that this would be like, older ages, but
Right.
like conversations on mutual orgasm, meaning like that sex was meant to be mutually pleasurable for everyone. Again, and how do you start to acknowledge like this woman Sheila Gregor did some research that there's a 40, I think it's 42% orgasm gap in the church, meaning in Christendom,
Right.
that 95% of men are having regular orgasms in sex, and only something like um maybe it's 47%, 48% of women are having regular orgasm, meaning there's this discrepancy in the frequency of orgasm. It's not mutually pleasurable for men and women
Right.
consistently. So bringing in and by the way, that has no basis in anatomy. There is no an anatomical reason that women would orgasm less, right? It's social. So, things like that, right? That's a very vulnerable, honest conversation
Yeah.
about um, you know, that that sex is safe, mutually pleasurable, and intimate.
Yeah. No, yeah, I really, I like everything that you're saying. I think that, that those conversations need to be had. And in your book, I want to dive into a couple of the quotes. At the beginning of the book, you said, "We are not just going to talk about sex. We're going to bless your sexuality. Your sexuality is a good part of you. It's the artwork of God that He has declared uh, good on the sixth day of creation." Talk a little bit about
Yeah.
that part of the book, the opening, introduction part.
Yeah. Man, um as I was writing my book, I did not expect that writing this book would bring me to tears so often. But there was like I felt like weekly for a while. God was just bringing me to tears for the men and the women. But obviously I'm writing to men, the men that would read this book. And um, I even like printed out little pictures, these like stock photos of men reading books.
Yeah.
They're up on the wall right over here. And I would pray. I would take one photo and just imagine, a made up story of a guy like, you know, and I would just pray, God, like, let me speak to these men. Like, um, or what's the point of writing a book? And so I think, in that section, there was a real desire that my book could be and bring something of God's fatherly blessing, on men that did not get a sex talk, or that suffered a lot in this area of their life, that you would feel the kindness of God through what I wrote. And because they're that sense that God obviously blessed everything in creation on day six. But he was particularly blessing the creation of man and woman. And I just imagine that as like, what if that was like a father blessing a son,
Right.
right? Trying to picture that as like God actually blessing Adam as a son, um, particularly sexuality. And it's just powerful. So, you know, I think there's something in Adam's heart as a lover that I hope every man feels blessed in as they read this book. Like, you are a lover. You aren't an animal. And um, we see that in Adam. Like, what does Adam do the first time he meets Eve, a naked, glorious woman? He breaks into poetry, right? Like there's something about him that is through and through a lover. And again, did it lead to sexual union? Of course it did, right? We know that, but like it there was something in him that was so moved by the glory of her beauty, and by her humanness, um, and the sense of belonging he felt to her.
Yeah, and we've been conditioned, and you say it in your book, to think that men just want sex,
Yes.
right? And then that's where it ends. And you say it's simply not true. Um, when counseling men, they tell you that they want love.
Yes.
So how did we get to this point where that's kind of how men have been boxed in as well? Just give them some food, water, and sex, and they'll be fine.
Right.
Because that's really not how we were created to be.
Right. Man, I don't know how that all got eroded fully, but there's something in our masculine culture that I think it's just too takes a lot of bravery to be vulnerable with your heart. And I think it's easy as men to hide behind something that looks more immovable, right? Like, we value men who are workers, as I say in the book, workers and warriors, right? Like and that's good. Like those are glorious traits in a man. The man that will, charge a building to rescue a child as a firefighter. That is
Right.
amazing. Or a man that just consistently shows up and works hard, right? And you can depend on him. That is amazing. But we don't often value the lover side of a man, right? The part that um we have little glimpses, but right, the part that like really loves his family. Um or the part that wants connection with his wife. Um I've never met a man in my office who's just wanted sex. And I've met some men that were pretty heavily sex addicted. But even those guys were dying
Well,
for more.
and I think a lot of it has come from hookup culture, right? That's kind of been
Yes.
running rampant through our world and our country, is the meaningless sex between two people, and that
Yes.
they feel a sense of accomplishment. They feel like, well, this is what it means to be a
Yeah.
man. And how does that impact men down the road from what you've seen in your office?
Yeah, you're naming it so well. That's really well said, Joel. Like, sex can be false initiation, right? It can feel like a father's blessing. You can feel like, yes, I've become a man, right? And sadly, that even becomes a part of some men's initiation, right? Is their
Yeah.
fathers. I've heard horror stories of men whose fathers bring them to prostitutes.
Oh my gosh.
As that's their initiation, right? And
Yeah.
or I'm gonna show you your first pornography as like a rite of passage. And so again, do you hear? It's like a sexualized ego. It's false empowerment, or the culture of boys, in their teenage years. If you're unfathered, sexuality feels really empowering.
Yeah.
And it can become a scoring, like you're naming well, right? Like how much did you get?
Right.
Right? How far did you go? Who did you hook up with? And so I think it's such a profound unfathered place in us.
Yeah, and then you mentioned pornography, and the combination of hookup culture and the extreme easy access to pornography now for young kids. That's a lot. That's a place where a lot of kids get their sex education,
Hmm.
is from watching porn,
Right.
and that's not real life,
Right.
but that's what they think, how they think they have to perform sexually to be a man.
Right.
And
Right.
then on the flip side, the girl who's also watching pornography
Right.
thinks like, well, this is what I have to submit to
Right.
because this is what sex is.
Mhm.
But porn is such a distortion of what sex is,
Mhm.
and the pictures are all muddied and all messed up, for what it's supposed to be in their future.
Mhm.
Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I talked about this thing called the orgasm gap, and it's true in the culture at large. It's true as I named in the church, like a 47% discrepancy, meaning we are overvaluing men's pleasure and undervaluing women's pleasure, right? And that's just true in like culturally, and it's about the same in the culture at large. In pornography, the orgasm gap is 88%. So it is extremely focused on male pleasure, right? And again, because their audience is primarily men. Now again, it's not exclusively, and it's actually trending more equal as the years go on, to where women are consuming pornography now. But it sets up this idea um there's no story of falling in love. There's no tenderness. Um, there's no um, there's no conversations uh, about, hey, we need to stop because something's coming up in my story, right?
Right.
Or hey, we need to stop because this hurts, or somebody's not into it, right? There's no care for each other. It focuses all the point on the sex and often on male release. It's highly misogynistic, in other words, right? There is even often a script, you know, you know, the words that are used to describe the women are often very derogatory in pornography. So yeah, it sets up um, a profound sense of harm for men and women. In other words, that men see sex as like a woman's pleased when when
Doing X,
I'm
Y, or
pleasured.
Z. Yeah.
Yeah, and there's no sense of care for a woman. Um, yeah, and again, even in the backdrop of saying like this can often be a place where a man goes to get again that false empowerment, to get that false sense of soothing, to his self-confidence or his bad day.
Yeah. And the exposure to pornography, we were talking a little bit before we started recording here, but that seems to be getting lower and lower and lower. Now I've heard, and you as well, we can't pinpoint the source, but average exposure down to like 8 or 9 years old.
Yes.
And a lot of that I think has to do with the unrestricted access to smartphones, or smartphones in general, because we think as parents, oh well, we put all the blockers on and we've got it all covered, but man, they know how to get around all that stuff. So
Hmm.
you have to constantly stay on it. It can't be
Hmm.
something that you just put a couple settings on and you don't look at it or you don't check in on them for 6 or 7 months. It's
Hmm.
got to be something that is a constant,
Hmm.
point of emphasis with proper usage of the phone. Should you give
Right.
your children a smartphone? I don't recommend that anybody give their kid a smartphone until after high school. Give them a
Hmm.
phone where they can contact you, but they don't need social media. I mean, I don't want to go off too off on a tangent here, but the numbers are clear. The earlier access to social media, the higher percentages of
Right.
anxiety, depression, and stress. And our kids just don't need that.
Hmm.
Oh, well, they'll be left
Right.
out. They won't. What they're going to do is instead of having a bunch of lukewarm friends, they're going to find a group of about 4 or 5 really good friends that they're going to be
Right.
able to communicate with and hang out with.
Hmm.
Now, what I wanted to try to transition to there was with the easy access to pornography and the earlier exposure to pornography, what do you suggest parents to do with their kids on having conversations about that?
Hmm.
Because again, if you don't have the conversation, in one of my earlier episodes, I think episode about 5 or 6, the guy that I interviewed on there was like, you need to have that conversation with your kid like 2 years ago. because when they get exposed to it, it's going to shock them if they've got no preparation for it.
Mhm.
And so, what do you suggest about having that conversation with your kid? Um, you know, trying to keep the innocence of your kid intact, but
Mhm.
also preparing them for when the enemy attacks. Because it's not a matter of if they're going to get exposed to pornography anymore. It's a matter of when.
Right. Right. Oh, it's so tragic. Yeah. Um, Again, I would start by saying, it's why it's important to honor their body curiosity, their questions early. Um, and I wrote a little ebook on how to give a sex talk to your children to talk more about that. It's on my website. Um, but like if you're setting the tone for healthy sexuality, right? Then you have something to work with to talk to them about what is pornography. Um, and and to say again, um, to always contrast for them the vision of like sex was meant to be this sacred thing that happens between two people who love each other. It's not meant to be posted as a picture or a video. So
Right.
starting to help them to have a concept for this is coming and why is it not good, right? I would challenge you not to say, well, it's because it's dirty.
Right.
Um, I don't think that's a good way to pitch it. I would say it's bringing something that's sacred and meant to be private into some in a public place, and it's not meant to be watched. Um, I would invite you to let your children know you'll probably feel like excited. So they don't feel shame for having been excited when they see pornography. You will feel arousal.
Right.
Again, that's why it's so important to acknowledge arousal is not the same as lust, but to say it will probably feel exciting and curious to want to keep looking. Um, but it's not as God didn't make our bodies to experience sex in that way. So, um, and again, leaving room for you're not going to be in trouble if you come talk to me. Um, you might feel bad for having seen this. You won't be in trouble with me. And I would encourage you to reward your children for telling you. Don't punish them for that's it. Go to your room, right? No, I would invite you like they are coming to you and confessing this or opening up about having seen this. I would be very careful with how you discipline around that because you want to keep that channel open
Yeah.
so that
I,
they feel safe.
yeah. I think that's a great point. And that's something that I honestly struggle with sometimes is, when my child comes to me when they've done something wrong, but they're telling me the truth.
Right.
I want to try, I try to find that balance of um, disciplining
Right.
for which disciplining is training, right?
Hmm.
Disciplining them for the action that was wrong, but also honoring them for being a truth teller because that's what we want
Hmm.
in our families. Do you have any recommendations on how someone could navigate that?
Um, yeah, again, um, and I would say the same thing about sexual abuse. Like you want to set up your children to feel safe to come to you. And that's where I would say celebrating their truth telling,
Yeah,
like take them out for ice cream. Thank you for telling me. I'm so grateful you told me that such and such happened. Um, and like encourage them like you were brave with the truth. Now again, you might say, well, what if they did it when they were doing something they were wrong, like they were on the
right.
iPad and they weren't supposed to be or something, right? Like
Yeah,
or I told them not to look at other people's phones, right? I told them they shouldn't be doing that and they, that they weren't allowed to be at so and so's house and look at a screen.
yeah. So I'm curious because here's what I do. And I want to get your opinion. Is
Okay.
a lot of times when those things happen, I'll kind of come to them with two different consequences. Like, hey, it was the consequence for what happened was going to be this, but since you told me the truth, it's going to be this, and I
Hmm.
lower the consequence.
Hmm. I here's my challenge. Not to challenge what you're saying, but just
Right.
in the vein of this, children do not know what's coming with pornography. They have no ability to know what they're picking.
Right.
So I would never discipline confession. And I would, in other words, they don't know what's coming. So, for example, and I tell this story in the book, there was a story of some parents whose son came to them and said, "I've been looking at pornography." He's 14 years old. And, they're devastated. And how and where and why and what? And they come to find out he had talked with some friends at school about how his friends were telling him how um, the girls they were into. And he realized he didn't know how to kiss a girl. So he went and Googled it, how to kiss a girl. And pornography popped up. Right. And
Yeah.
again, what I would want to say is of course that was exciting. Right. And did he at some level then begin to participate? Yes. Right. He came back to it and he came back to it. But then he came to his parents pretty desperate. Again, I would really encourage you to celebrate
Yeah.
the truth telling. Thank you for telling us. We're so proud of you for telling us. Again, they obviously shut off access. Like, we need to help you,
Right.
right? So if we're gonna, so I mean, this is tricky, right?
Yeah.
Like, because it's
Honor truth telling as much as you can.
yes,
Yeah. Awesome. Well, Sam, I want to be respectful of your time. I appreciate all the wisdom that you've given to us. To the guys that are listening right now, we've just like scratched the surface
yeah,
on the book. I mean, we could go on for another 2 or 3 hours if we really had to, and talking about all the details and all the different things that he puts in the book. But it's a great resource. I highly recommend it to give a read through. Sam, where can our listeners find you on social media, websites, that kind of stuff?
yeah. You can go to my website, Sam Joleman, JOLMAN.com, and my publisher is actually still doing a free BOGO offer. So if you buy the book, you get a free one, which is really cool. You also get a free ebook on how to give a sex talk to your children from my website. I also write on Substack. So if you want to go read ongoing articles and be a part of that community, samjolman.substack.com. And then kind of wherever your favorite social media is, I'm probably there
Okay.
talking some.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for coming on. It's been a blessing to have you on and impact our community of men. And look forward to having conversations with you again in the future.
Joel, this is so meaningful. Thanks for having me.
My pleasure.